Hello everyone, let me introduce myself. I am Facundo Carballo and today I will explain you all about WebSockets. From how WebSockets works, why is the importance of using WebSockets instead of simple HTTP requests, how to connect a React app, a React NextJS app with a WebSocket implemented in Golang. All of it using this app that I made. Is a chat app that allows you to log in our database, in this MySQL database, where we have 3 users. In this case, this one, this other one, and this other one. The main idea is that all of these users can chat with each other directly, one by one, or in groups, like WhatsApp or Telegram. So if we log in with these users, we will see the home screen of this application, this chat application, where we can see our friends. In this case, the session of the left is Facundo, the session of the middle is Gonzalo, and the session of the right is Lucila. These are our 3 users for this example. So each session will make a WebSocket with our server, our Golang server. These WebSockets will allow the sessions of this client to receive messages in real time of all the users that are sending message to this particular user. And also, will allow the user to send message and see an example of this using this directly chat with Gonzalo as Facundo. I am Facundo. I will send this message to Gonzalo. Hello, how are you? I send this message and Gonzalo received this message immediately in real time. That's because Gonzalo and Facundo, all of these 2 sessions have a WebSocket with our server, and well, Facundo sends through the WebSocket the message, and the server received that information and decided to deliver it to Gonzalo through WebSockets too. That's for particular chats one by one, but in this application we also have groups chats where Facundo, Gonzalo, and Lucila are in the same group, so they can send and receive messages like in any group of WhatsApp or Telegram. So I will open this chat group from the session of Facundo, from the session of Gonzalo, and from the session of Lucila. If I, as Facundo, I send this message, hello, I am Facundo, Gonzalo will receive this message with the ID number 1 that represents me as Facundo, and Lucila will receive this message like Gonzalo with the ID of 1 that represents Facundo in the database. If Gonzalo sends a message, Facundo will receive the message with the ID number 2, that is the ID of Gonzalo in our database, and Lucila will receive the message with the ID number 2 because Gonzalo have the ID number 2 in our database. So the same for Lucila. Hello, I am Lucila. And Gonzalo and Facundo will receive the message with the ID in the left that represents Lucila in our database. That is just an example to identify the users, but can maybe be our photo or something like that. But for this tutorial, I decided to use just an ID because it's more simple. So in this video, we will see this, how implement something like this. But first, we will see the basics of WebSockets. It will be separated in sections. The first section will be understand why we have to use these WebSockets instead of HTTP requests, when it's important to use these WebSockets. Then we will try to understand how to make a simple connection, very simple connection, with a React Next.js app and with a Golang server that has an endpoint to upgrade your session to WebSocket. And then we will see how to implement this chat one by one and chats of groups in the WebSocket. That will be the roadmap of this video. So I invite you to stay with me. Well, if you like this kind of videos, I invite you to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel because that will help me a lot. So please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Why we need WebSockets instead of using simple HTTP requests? So in this case, we have a chat application here where you can send message to a particular user from a particular user, and also you can send message to groups like WhatsApp or Telegram. Why here it's important to use WebSockets, or why it's convenient using WebSockets instead of simple HTTP requests? To explain that, I have this diagram where I will try to show you why WebSockets in this particular situation it's better. So imagine the situation where we don't have WebSockets. We only have HTTP request. So in the HTTP request, the client requests to the server some data. Can be data to insert, like a post request, or data that the client wants using a GET request, for example. But always the client have to tell to the server, hey, I want that. I want to do that. The server never can send anything to the client if the client doesn't request first. That's important. That's the main reason of why we are using here WebSockets. So here are WebSockets. The WebSockets allows to the server to send data to the client without any request of the client. In this case, for the chat application, the client can receive message, but the client doesn't have when they have to receive those messages. So the client will have to be requesting every time in a pooling every time if there are some messages for them, and that will be inefficient. So in this case, with WebSockets, we are doing this. The client requests to the server to open a WebSocket through an HTTP request through an endpoint dedicated to open this WebSocket. The server, well, if they have all the conditions, well, the server will say, okay, I will open a WebSocket with you. Perfect. And then the server can send to the client any messages without the previous request of the client. So for the chat application, imagine this situation where the client A wants to send a message to the client B. The client A sends through WebSockets the message, and the server receives that message. The server have to think, well, I have to send this message to other client that is connecting to me via another WebSocket. So I will have to iterate as a server for each client that is connected to me and verify if the client is the same. And well, if it's the same, I will send the message. And in this case, the client B will receive the message because the server will send the message through the WebSocket, and the client will be notified by an event and can display this message automatically in real time in their screen. If we use, for this case, HTTP request, we as a client, we have to be requesting every time for new messages when maybe we'll never get any message, and in the most of the time we will be getting the same data every time, and it's totally inefficient. So in this case, real-time applications, we need WebSockets because we are delivering to the server the rights to send us data when the server wants, and we as a client, we will receive that information and we'll display to in the screen. It's just that. This is the importance of using WebSockets, and it's why we need to use it when we require it, because not every time we need WebSockets. We need WebSockets in some applications that handles real-time data, but for other applications, maybe we don't need WebSockets because it's just simple posts and GET requests, and it's that. But for this kind of applications, we need WebSockets. We will see how to connect a React NextJS application with a WebSocket implemented in Golang. So to do that, first of all, we, as the React application, as the client of the WebSocket, we have to make some request to the server to tell to the server, hey, I want to open a WebSocket with you. First of all, this. To do that, we as a client have to create this new WebSocket object, passing here the endpoint where the server will implement and upgrade you as a client through the WebSocket. So that's for the client, only that. Now, in the server side, in this case of Go, we have to get a specific endpoint to the WebSocket. And this endpoint of the server have to match with this endpoint that we put here in the client side. They have to be the same. The client have to call to this endpoint. The server have to have a dedicated endpoint to open WebSockets with clients. In this case, for this server will be /ws, and we'll have a handler to make that upgrade of clients through WebSockets. Also, we need this course policy to make sure that our client, in this case, will be the React application that will be running on the localhost 3000, get all the permissions that they need to open those WebSockets and so on. This is a Go routine that we need, but it's just for the chat application. This Go routine will be explained in detail later. Now we will concentrate on other things like how to connect a React application with the WebSocket and how to send and receive messages through the WebSockets. Only that for now. So we just need these functions. The endpoint dedicated to open the WebSocket, the course policy, and obviously we have to run our server. Just that. Now we will see what does this handler. Well, this handler has a lot of line of code commented. Those lines are lines of logic of the chat application. We only need these lines to understand how WebSocket works, how WebSocket send and receive message. This is for the chat application and have some logic of the chat application itself. This is more generic, this code. So first of all, we need an upgraded that will be from this module of WebSocket that upgrader. Here we pass some parameters like the read buffer size, the size of the buffer to read from this buffer, and also the write buffer size, the space that we can insert data through the WebSocket. And this check origin parameter that is in reality a function that receives the request of the client when the client make this request, because this is a request using the protocol of WebSocket, but it's a request. We receive the request, and well, with the request we have a lot of information like the URL from this client games, the body, for example, or a lot of information from the request, and we can, as a server, decide if the client have the right to make this WebSocket or not. In this case, we just have to return true, so all the clients will have the rights to make this WebSocket with us for this particular video. Here we upgrade the connection with our client, passing here the response writer, the request, and this pointer nil. This pointer reference to some previous connection, but for this case, like we are starting the first connection with the client, we only pass nil because we don't have any connection, any previous connection. So we just have to pass nil here. And well, then we check if there is an error with this upgrade connection. If there is an error, we just have to inform to the client. And then if there is not an error, all it's okay. We have to make this. This is a differ function that makes that the server close the connection properly when the client finishes the connection or when something happens. The server will be responsible to close the connection and close all the resources. Here we have a Go routine that will be running on the background, but for this we will be this later. First, I want to see this for loop. This for loop never ends. It will be running over and over again every time. But here the server will be waiting for some message of the client. This for loop never ends, but when the for loop goes here, server is waiting for some message. Is waiting for the event of a message in the WebSocket. When the server receives a message, well, execute this function and get the message type, the payload, and an error. If there is an error, well, we just have to print it. But if there is not an error, we are getting the message in bytes with this payload. And what we do here, what I like to do here is transform this payload, this array of bytes, in some structure of message that I can understand. This structure, it's here, have an ID, an user ID, a boolean variables, and the message, finally. This is the string of the message that we send from the client side. So what this function do is wrap the array of bytes and transform to this structure of message. And if there is no errors, we can print the message as a string. So this for loop is to read message from the client. Now we will see how to send message to the client as a server without the request, the previous request from the client. For that is this Go routine that will be running on the background and, well, have a counter initialized on 0 and then a for loop and other for loop that never ends. And this for loop, what this does is create a message, a structure of message with the count as an ID to identify the message with some number that's it's modifying every time. And well, this is the message that we will see on the client side. Hello, I am the server. I am sending this message without your previous request. Okay, so we have to do this, that is the JSON.Marshall. So once we have this message structure, we have to wrap this message structure to a byte, to an array of bytes, because we have to send the bytes through the WebSocket. We can't send a structure through the WebSocket. We have to send bytes. So we have to marshal this message, and well, we will get the array of bytes or an error. If we have an error, well, like always, we print this message and we'll continue. This continue will get here again. We'll try to make the message again and again. And here, well, we use the connection to write the message through the WebSocket. So here in the first parameter, we are declaring the type message that we are sending through the WebSocket. And here, as a second parameter, we are sending the byte, the rate of bytes that we want to send. Again, if there is an error, we just have to print it to inform us, as the maintainers of the server. We have to know there is an error. And here I am incremented the counter by 1, and also a time that sleep that will be waiting for 5 seconds to go back here and send again another message. That's for see slowly the message came from the client side. So with this explained, we just have to see this in action. So to do that, we just have to go here to the application. I have to log in first. And now when I open some chat like this or any chat, I will be open a WebSocket, because this function, it's called when I open some chat. Maybe a chat with a friend, 1 by 1, or maybe a chat with a group. But the case is when a chat is open, this function is executed and will create the WebSocket from the client to the server. So I will open this chat with Gonzalo and the WebSocket will be opened. So if we see on the console, we are receiving the message from the server every 5 seconds. Hello, I am the server and I am sending this message without your previous request. That's correct. I am not requesting this information from the server. Well, how we receive that information in the client? Because we are sending this, but how the client knows or is listened to this? Because the client have to be listened in some way to this message that the server maybe will send to the client. That it's here in the chat component. We are setting this socket.onMessage event, and every time that this onMessage event happens, we'll execute this function. This function gets an event as a parameter, and well, this event has an attribute that is the data of this event, and that is what we want to read. Here I parsed this data to a JSON format, and then we just print on the console like this message from the server. And every time that the server sends a message, this onMessage event happens and will execute this function. So every time that the server sends a message, this function is executed and print on the console this structure, this JSON that we receive. And here's the message. Hello, I'm the server and I am sending this message without your previous request. That's fine. Now, how we as clients send message to the server? Using WebSockets. So to do that, we will be using this input here to send message to the WebSocket. I will explain you how to make that first in the code. So every time that I type here some message like this, hello, and I press to this button, this send button, this function is executed. This function, what it does is create an object with the same structure of this message or some parameters of this message structure, but these parameters is all the parameters that we need from the server side to read and understand the data. In this case, for this particular case, this simple case, we just need the message. Then I transform this object to a string using JSON.stringify, and I send this string through the WebSocket. Just that. And the WebSocket will have to be able to read that data, read those bytes that we can see here, message bytes, and this is the bytes of the message. Like we can see here in the code, we are printing that payload that we receive from the client. And then in the server, we wrap these bytes through some structure to get the data in some readable format. And well, then we just print in the console of the server the message that we receive from the client. Obviously, for the chat application, for example, we do more things. Here is the proof. There is a lot of things that we have to do to make the chat application. But the basics are these. This is how some React application, a front-end application, communicate with the WebSocket running in some server, in this case, implemented on Golang. For this particular application, we need to know which user of our database here is representing each session of the client that is connecting to our server through the WebSocket. So we, as a client, have to tell to the server, hey, I am the user A, for example, or I am Facundo. I have the credentials to be Facundo, because the server will have to know who is the client that is sending that message and to who the server have to send this message. So, for example, if we see this particular chat with Facundo, that is the session of the left, and Gonzalo, who is the session of the middle of the screen, I, as Facundo, I can send a message to Gonzalo, the session of the middle, telling them, how are you? And when I press to this button, the message will send through the WebSocket, and the server will receive that message, and the server will have to identify to what client that is connected to the server, or not, maybe, through the WebSocket, have to send it so the client can receive that message and display to the screen. So in this case, I will send this message as Facundo, as the session 1 that is connected to the server through the WebSocket, and Gonzalo, that is another session, another client connected to the same server through another WebSocket, will have to receive that message because the server knows that this session corresponds to the user of Gonzalo. So how we do that? We send this message here, and Gonzalo received that message, and not other sessions. Only Gonzalo. Only the session of the middle, that is the session of the user Gonzalo. How we do that? Well, to do that, we have to tell to the server, hey, I am the user Facundo. These are my credentials as user Facundo. Verify that, and the server will have to store that data to reference that client, that connection client, with this particular identifier or this particular user ID, this particular user reference through our database to identify which client is which user. We map the client with that user. That's what the server have to do. So to do that, we will implement this method. When the client open a WebSocket, creating this new object, passing here the WebSocket protocol and the local host or the URL where the server is running. Once the socket is open, we'll execute this event and then we'll execute this function. This function will send to the server a JWT token that is generated by the server when we log in. Every time that we log in, when I pass my credentials to the server, here I am receiving from the server a JWT token that I stored in the state of this React application. If you want to know how to implement JWT tokens and how to interact with those, I have a YouTube video in my channel. The link will be in the description too. I recommend that you understand perfectly JWT token before to try to understand WebSockets and how to implement WebSockets with JWT? Well, in this function, when the event on open is happen, so when the WebSocket is opened, the client will execute this function. This function creates an object of the type message, that is the structure of the message that the server creates. The server reads that particular struct or messages. So we have to create that structure with the arguments that we need to pass. We don't have to pass all of these arguments, but only that we consider that is relevant to the server for this case. So for this case, I just pass the user ID that I am. When I log into this application, I receive from the database my user ID. So here I pass to the server, hey, I am this client with this user ID. I am sending to you a JWT token using this argument. And this is the message that I will send you, which is the JWT token, JWT string. So the server will receive this JWT token as a message. So if we see how the WebSocket read messages, the WebSocket read messages with this function, this handler, that is connected to this endpoint of WS, which the endpoint that we call here. This handler creates the connection with the client with this function, and then we'll be here waiting for some message of the user. So when the server is open, immediately the client sends to the server a message, sends particularly this JWT token, the JWT token of the user. So we as a server, when we get some message, we get the payload, the array of bytes, and then we have to transform this byte to this structure that we see before using this body to message function that wraps the array of bytes to this specific structure. And then we just have to ask to this message if it's a JWT. If it's a JWT token, okay, we as a server are understanding that the client wants to show us his credentials so we can identify the user ID or the user of our database to this particular client, this particular session that is connected to us through the WebSocket. So we'll read the JWT token using this function that we get the ID of the user that is created in the database. We get the ID from this JWT token using this function. If the ID is nil, okay, it was an error transforming the JWT token and getting the ID. But if there is not an error, well, we just have to set the client ID to this ID. And then for this particular case, we will get the groups, all the groups that this user is on. For example, in this case, Facundo have two groups, the group number 1 and the group number 2. But Lucila, for example, have only one group, that is group number 2. So here we get all the groups of the client, so we can verify them when some session sends a message to a group. Well, if there is any session connected that is related to this particular group that is receiving a message, well, we have to send to this particular client the message that we receive because this client belongs to this group. That's for that, only for that. And here, well, we just set to the client structure the groups that we get here from this function that is a simple query to the database. I forget to tell you that when the server creates the connection, then creates a client structure for this particular connection. So here is passing the connection that we get here, and here is the user ID, but the user ID that corresponds to the user of the database. But like here, in this particular moment, we don't know which user is the user that is making this connection. We have to put here some constant value like this to identify when a user is not validated. And here, finally, we just have to pass some empty array of integers that correspond to the groups of this particular user. I create this structure of client to handle better the connections because we have the connection of the WebSocket, that is this, basically the connection to through the server to the client. Each client will have a connection. And here I aggregate these two items that is relevant for this particular case of this application. That is the ID and the groups. Getting back to the case of JWT token, we just have to set here the ID and the groups that is relevant for this particular case of the chat application. And then we will continue. So the server will be waiting here again and again for some new messages of the client. If there is not a JWT token, well, the server will ask for the client ID, because if their client ID is equal to -1, that means that the client is not authenticated through the WebSocket, because we don't know who is this client as WebSocket. So first, the client have to always, for this particular case, validate their identity, passing the JWT token first. And then, well, if the client ID is different from -1, well, if the message is for a group, we'll insert the message in a particular group. And if the message is for some particular user, well, it will insert the message for this particular user. These functions are just simple ASQL calls to store procedures that makes this insert into the tables and all the things that they have to do. The code of the SQL functions, store procedures, and tables, it's here on the DB folder, SQL. Here you will have all the store procedures and here all the tables that I use for this application. You will find this also in the GitHub repo, in the server folder, then DB folder, SQL folder, and here is the store procedures, and here is the tables of the SQL. So getting back, once we insert the message in the particular tables and so on, then we send this message to the broadcast. The broadcast is a channel that contains messages. Those messages that are stored in this broadcast channel will be reading from this function, handle messages, that is running in the background with this go routine that is calling here. Every time that the server creates, well, the go routine goes to the background and start looping, waiting for, in this case, waiting for some message that is on the broadcast channel. So here, this function will be waiting here for some message that is entry to this broadcast. And here, well, we will receive that message and we'll iterate for each client that is connected to our server. In this case, I am only 3 sessions, like we can see here on the diagram. So will be 3 clients sessions connected. So we'll be iterate 3 times. And each time we have the client, for example, in this case, we will be the first client, the second client, and the third client. So for the first client, we have to ask us, this client have to receive this message? Well, for that, there is this function that solves that problem. And here is an if statement that asks to the message if there is for a group. If the message is for a group, well, we have to use this function of the structure of client. That is, this client belongs to this group. If the client belongs to this group, it's okay. This message is for you because you belong to this group. This function belongs to this group. Iterate for each group ID that is stored in this array of integers. And if the ID that we pass here as a parameter match with the group ID that we are iterating, returns true. That makes that this ID that we pass here as a parameter belongs to the group's ID that this client is stored in this array. And if the function iterate for each group and doesn't exist the ID that we pass here, well, this session doesn't have the rights to receive that message. This client doesn't have to receive this message, so returns false. Now, if the message is not for a group, it's just for a particular client, a particular user, well, it's more simple because we just have to make sure that the message structure have the toID parameter argument that indicates to who is this message, which user will receive this message. So here is the ID of the recipient of the message. And well, we just have to match it with the client ID that we are iterating. For example, here we send this message to Gonzalo. So the server have 3 connections: Facundo, Gonzalo, and Lucila. These 3 clients are connected to the server. So here, the server receive that message from the broadcast, iterate for each client, ask himself, have to receive this message, this client? Well, first of all, imagine that the server contains Facundo as the first client of this loop. The message is for a group? No. Okay, so the message to ID is equal to the client ID? And no, because to ID is Gonzalo. The to ID argument is Gonzalo, that is 2, the ID number 2. And Facundo, the client that it's here, have the ID number 1. So this will return false, and this will go back here and iterate again for other client. Here is the client number 2, Gonzalo. We ask if this client, this particular client, have to receive this message. So the message is for a group? No. The message is for a particular person. Okay, here, the else statement. The message that toID is equals to the client ID? Yes, here, yes, because toID is 2 and the client ID is 2. Okay, that's true. We'll print this and we'll send the message. To send the message, we make this. We marshal the message, the structured message. We transform that structure into an array of bytes because we have to send through the WebSocket an array of bytes. We check if there is an error, and then we send for this particular client. Using this connection, we write the message using this type of message, text message, and here passing the array of bytes. Also, we check if there is an error. If there is not an error, okay, this send function ends and will iterate again. For the third and finally the last client session connected to this WebSocket, to this server. So it's the client number 3 with ID number 3, this, which is Lucila. So we ask again, have this user have to receive this message, this client? Okay. The message is for a group? No. Okay. The message to ID is equal to the client.id? No, because message to ID is equal to client.id? No, because message to the ID is equal to 2 and the client ID is equal to 3. So this will return false, this will return false, so it will be looping again. But the client ends and, well, the for loop will be waiting here again for new messages that are stored in this broadcast channel. So now we will see how the groups, how the chat groups works with this particular server. So if you can see here, the session 1 is Facundo, the session 2 is Gonzalo, the session 3 is Lucila. Facundo is friend of Gonzalo, Gonzalo is friend of Facundo and Lucila is only friend of Gonzalo. But Facundo, Gonzalo, and Lucila have the same group, that is the group number 2. So if we go into this group for each user, we will see that we can send messages, and as Facundo and Gonzalo and Lucila will receive that message, will have to receive that messages, and they have to identify who is that is sending that message. So if I send a message to this group as Facundo, hello, I am Facundo, and send that message, I can see here in my session as Facundo, but also I can see here in my session of Gonzalo. And here is telling me that the user ID of the user that sends this message is Facundo. Obviously, I could put here some image, but it's more quickly put here some identifier. And Lucila also knows that this message is sent for the user with ID number 1. So each user knows from who user is this message. So each user of this group will know from which user is sending these messages. For example, if I am Gonzalo, it's the same. Facundo will notice that Gonzalo, or the user ID number 2, sent this message, and Lucila, the same, will notice that this particular user with ID number 2 sent this particular message. We'll try it for Lucila too, and the same here. Facundo noticed that this user that sends this message is the user with ID number 3. Gonzalo noticed that he is receiving this message from the user number 3, and well, we already know how works this entire server, this entire WebSocket, and how we can make this chat application works. Because it's just sending messages, and the server have to understand who is the user that is sending this message, and understand also to who I have to send this message. Who is the client session that have to receive this message that this other client sends to me. When the server understands that, we just have completed the main thing of this chat application. And well, I think that that's all for this video. I hope that you really understand better how WebSocket works, how implement a WebSocket using a React application, and in this case a Golang server, and also how this chats application works, how the server have to think to make the things that the server wants, or in this case the application wants, that is receiving and sending messages to each session that is connected, and these sessions have to be identified by the server from a particular way that can understand who is the user that is behind this session to, well, know, okay, this client is the user Facundo, and this session is the user Gonzalo. So the server can, well, know to who user I have to send this particular message that I receive from another client, another user, another session that is connected to me through the WebSocket. So if you have any doubts about WebSockets or anything, let me know on the comments. I will respond you. Also, I ask you again, to you, that hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, because that helps me a lot to grow up on YouTube, okay? So, I hope that you enjoyed the video, and also the main important thing is that you understand all about WebSockets. See you on the next video.